right now. Yep. All right. Let's go.
Okay, so here we are. We're finally down to the meat and the potatoes, so to speak, of what we've been discussing for the past several weeks. We've set the contextual foundation for a lot of the different things we're going to discuss today. Again, just as a reminder, we're still within the Bronze Age. And the three battles we're going to be discussing today, I'm not going to present them in chronological order. The first one actually occurred after the second one. But it provides a context, a regional context, that kind of goes back to what we were discussing in the previous webinars, where we had mentioned that different civilizations, depending upon their regions and areas, enter the Bronze Age at different times. So we'll provide the first one with some context, and then we'll move on to the two set-piece battles, which both involve Egypt.
Cool.
Okay.
Ian, your fan's still a bit noisy.
Oh, is it? Let me turn that off.
Ian's noisy fan. That's his number one fan.
Okay.
All right. So, and before we begin, Ian, I think it was you, Ian, that our last session you asked Levant, where did the term come from? Was that you or Matt? I can't recall.
Oh, I asked.
Okay, I apologize. So I looked it up, and that's our admin note here at the top. Mediterranean lands off East Italy, especially the coastal region and islands of Asia Minor, Syria, Lebanon, late 15th century from Middle French, the Orient. The Latin root comes from levare, to raise, as in lever, and it was so called because the region, at least from the perspective of Western Europeans, was in the east, the direction of the sun, where the sun would rise. So it would raise. So
the Romans called it the east or something.
Yeah. So it has Latin roots with the Latin states, and that's where we get the term Levant. Levant.
There you go.
And now we know. I thought about that last night when I was putting this outline together. I was like, I forgot to look that up. So now we know. Okay. So I want to briefly pull this up. Let's get this web page going here. I have a few web pages that we can look at today, and a few strategic illustrations to kind of help us digest this material. But the first thing I want to look at, this is the battle. Like I said, it's not presented in chronological order, but this is called the Tamsa Valley Slaughter. And this is something that archaeologists originally discovered back in 1996. And since that time, there have been a number of ongoing excavations, to try to unravel the mystery behind this. Who did it involve? It was hundreds, possibly thousands, of Baltic warriors, and some estimates are up to 4,000 warriors. But the origins of these warriors are very debated, but radiological and DNA evidence, carbon dating and DNA investigations suggest that these people came from Polish and Swedish ancestry. And essentially what we're talking about here is in 1996, there was an archaeological dig going on at Tamsa, which is an area in modern day Northeast Germany. And they found the skeletal remains of a human. And in the back of the arm of one of these humans, right around this area right here, they found a flint arrowhead. Complete flint arrowhead lodged in the bone, and it kind of piqued their curiosity because they were trying to piece this together, and they were wondering, well, was this person, did they get in an altercation with another with a hunter? Was this a small scale thing? They did some dating on it, and the carbon dating suggests that the remains were about 3,200 years old, so we're looking circa 1180 BC or so. So, and to put that in perspective, at this time, Northern Europe, Northeastern Europe was, for lack of a better term, it was kind of a backwater, at least compared to parts of Egypt and the Levant, Mesopotamia, areas like that. We're talking about in Northeastern Europe, these were nomadic cultures that were, hunter-gatherers, and they really lacked the sophistication and organization of those societies that we've identified as agrarian societies.
Mm-hmm.
And prior to this discovery, there was really no evidence of, no specific evidence of human on human violence. These were people that were totally consumed with simply migrating and following their game and hunting and basically existing, trying to live day to day. So the idea that people would, engage in constant raids against one another. That takes an incredible amount of energy and planning and resources. So this was something very unique. And because it was unique, since '96, they continued digging through these remains. And as they kept digging, they continued unearthing all these remains, more and more skeletal remains. And they started piecing together the idea that this wasn't just an isolated incident where we're talking about maybe one or two people getting in an altercation or a small raid between tribes. This was a major battle that possibly lasted for a week. And they called a slaughter because at this river crossing, they unearthed hundreds of bodies with forensic evidence on these, well, I shouldn't say bodies, but skeletal remains, with forensic evidence on these skeletons indicating that they were in a heated battle. They found scarring and marks along the bones where axes or hand tools of some sort, spears, were obviously used to attack the person, the victim. They found more skeletal remains with different sorts of weapons embedded in the skeleton. But the interesting thing is what they did not find was any evidence of a settlement. So unlike a lot of the other battles that we examine throughout history, there's no evidence of a siege or a permanent settlement. There wasn't necessarily any pottery or walls. So that suggests that these two warring groups, these two opposing groups of significant size, migrated or traveled from an area fairly far away from the battleground to meet one another and fight. And after 20, approximately 20 years of digging and researching, there's still no definitive answer on why these people were fighting and what the point of the battle was. And I'll show you this webpage, and it comes to us. This comes to us from sciencemagazine.org. And I wanted to bring this webpage up because it really helps. I mean, pictures do go a long way, and hopefully you have a good view of this. But this is just some of the excavation that was unearthed. This article was written in 2016, so it's relatively recent. And it says here, this caption, I don't know if you can read it on your screens, but excavation of an ancient battlefield in northern Germany revealed signs of a great battle, such as closely packed bones as seen in this 2013 photo of the site. One area of 12 square meters held 1,478 bones, including 20 skulls. So this wasn't necessarily a mass grave where these bodies were dumped, but the way they discovered these bodies, the way they were articulated, the way the skeletal remains were posed, and the forensic evidence suggests that a lot of these people were fighting and were killed on the spot, or after being killed, they were dumped into the nearby Tamsa River and just discarded. And
is the idea this is relevant is like it's one of the first relevant big battles or something like that?
Well, this is relevant to our studies, yes, because one, as it pertains to military history, this is evidence of one of the first major battles in northeastern Europe. But it's not history in the strict academic sense because we're not relying upon documented evidence here. We don't have any sort of written record of what occurred here. It's all archaeological evidence, and that's what's fascinating about it. Is it's before a time when we were talking about the rise of proto-written languages. This is before the time of proto-written languages in northeastern Europe. This is before the time of standing armies and defensive fortifications.
It's before the time of standing armies. Okay, right.
Yeah. So the idea that all the conventional ideas that we hold as historians and archaeologists to an extent and forensic archaeologists, this discovery really rocked all of that, because now we're looking at this major engagement and no one can figure out why. So on the one hand, it offers some credence to the idea that Northeastern Europeans were a bit more sophisticated than we give them credit for. Because, like I said, we typically look at Northeastern Europe, at least during this time, as kind of a cultural and social backwater. People were still very much developing. On the other hand, how sophisticated are people that engage in such a brutal act of violence? That's a question we have to ask ourselves. But here we have an illustration of an artistic rendering of what the people would have looked like back then. we have a soldier here on what we would consider cavalry, because he's on horseback and he has a spear. The man in the middle, they're showing some of the animal hide clothing he had, along with the typical sword of the period. And as I mentioned, the initial discovery had a flint arrowhead in the back of the upper arm of the bone, lodged in the bone. So there were bows and arrows being used here. And here's a really great photo. It shows right here the flint arrowhead embedded in the upper arm bone first alerted archaeologists to the ancient violence in the Talensa Valley. So that's what they discovered. Pretty interesting stuff. And here, this illustration, I wish I could make it larger for you, but it's showing some of the things they carried: wooden clubs, bronze axe heads, bronze arm ring. So these all lend themselves very well, materially anyway, to the period. We can see that these people were very much into bronze working, and their weapons were various sorts of clubs, and they had various sort of ornamentation. So that fits in the piece very well. What does not fit in the piece very well is this large-scale organized engagement, which just doesn't make sense.
Those weapons, are they weapons of war, or are they just, like an axe can be used for chopping a tree, a club could?
Well, that's a great question, and it's really it's fairly intuitive. I mean, an axe with these particular axes, many of them were identified as utility tools. They could be used for survival stuff, and obviously chopping down trees and forging and everything. But they were very much used as weapons of war. Now the clubs, on the other hand, I suppose. Depending on the club style, some could be used for hunting, but typically if you're going to hunt an animal, you want, especially large mammals, game animals, you want to pierce the animal. So if it runs away, it will bleed out, and you can track it, and you can track the blood trail. Clubs, very rarely are clubs used as, except for the most primitive cultures, very rarely are they used as hunting implements. Typically, your hunting tools are going to be spears and bows and arrows. So mostly, especially when we look in the Bronze Age, any sort of maces or clubs or blunt instruments are designed to kill other people by bashing their skull. Traumatic damage to the skull. So these were implements of war, and they were used for, but they were mostly used. All of our evidence up to this point was saying that they were mostly used for raiding, not for the large scale organized fighting. And this is a picture of a bronze arrowhead that had penetrated a skull, reaching the brain. So this is a reverse shot, like an interior shot of a skeletal remain of a skull. And then they're showing that's just an overview of the river. This is a great picture right here. This speaks to those clubs. This is the blunt force trauma that one of those clubs would have delivered to a human being, to the skull right there. So that's just a brief article, and I just want to bring it up to put things in perspective. 3,200 years ago, we had human beings slaughtering one another wholesale. Don't know why. Not sure exactly what the whole point was. The unearthed remains there don't reveal like any sort of invaluable loot or treasure or anything. These two groups just got together and just went at it for whatever reason, and we still don't know today.
So these types of battles weren't happening in like that Mesopotamia or like.
Well, now this battle was dwarfed by the battles in Mesopotamia and Egypt, which is what we're going to talk about next.
Okay, but in Europe, this is relevant.
Yeah, but in Europe, and again, that's why I presented this one first, because the next battle we're going to talk about, Megiddo, actually occurred in 1457 BC. So that Megiddo happened much earlier than the battle that we just discussed.
Yeah, right. Okay.
It happened in Egypt.
Okay.
So this is where we're going to see a dramatic shift in the size and scope of it. Yeah. Okay. So Megiddo is was an ancient Canaan town, where it is the remains of it are near modern day Israel. And let me pull this up here. Pull this link. All right, so Megiddo or Megiddo, depending on who you talk to, it's going to be southwest of Damascus and north of Jerusalem. So it's right in this area right here where we have the N in Palestine. And what's significant about this area geographically is we have the great empire of Egypt to the southwest, which controlled a wide swath of land here and across the Mediterranean coast. And then to their north, we have the Hittites. And these cultures we will see throughout the Bronze Age period clash continuously. And the reason this area is so contested in what is modern day Israel is because back then it was a key location for overland trade routes. Whoever controlled, whoever controlled this area, this coastal area, could have clear access to the sea, and also would be able to. It would facilitate their trade in the launching of caravans into the Arabian Peninsula, across the Sinai Peninsula, up into Asia Minor. So it's an economic and trade necessity.
Right, because like everything coming out of Africa or going into Africa, you can collect like a fee. Like you can decide if someone can go in or out. For a bit of money, right? And same with people coming in from the Mediterranean Sea, Arabian Peninsula. It's like you're this hub, and you can get all this money, and like everyone's willing to trade with you because you're at the hub, right? Is that how it works?
That's exactly it. And Egypt also had gold, tons and tons of gold.
Egypt has gold, right?
Yeah, and everyone sought Egyptian gold and silver. They thought it was wonderful and beautiful. And the Egyptians, on their part, they, at first the trade was a boom, but their population grew so exponentially that the trade became a necessity, as it did for the remainder of Bronze Age society. Societies had thrived on this trade and this commerce. And if the trade were to suddenly stop, or a region was cut off from trade, then the civilization would collapse. And that's one of those theories when we talk about the late Bronze Age collapses. Perhaps there was some major disruption in the trade. But with this particular battle, Megiddo, it occurred between 10,000 Egyptians, led by Pharaoh Tamsa III, versus 15,000 Syrian Canaanite rebels. So we have the Egyptians versus the Canaanites. And the Canaanite rebels were a coalition of regional princes that formed under King DeRusha. I put an asterisk here because the numbers on this vary. What we do know is that there were more Syrian Canaanite rebels than there were Egyptians. But our source for this battle, which occurred in 1457 BC, comes from an Egyptian scribe that recorded the entire battle in his journal on a daily basis. And then his recounting was then carved into the temple at Luxor in Egypt. The temple, where's that here? We'll get to that in a second. But his recounting was basically carved into walls in hieroglyphics, and that's why we have some sort of compelling record about this and some more detailed records. Now, the significance of Megiddo is it is the first battle where we have an eyewitness account of what transpired.
Oh, okay. So 1457 BC. Okay.
Yeah, so this is where we actually get into the historical aspect of it. We have some sort of, granted, it's hieroglyphics and it's based more on pictographs than it is on like a proto-written language, but it is some sort of initial documentation, and that's what historians thrive upon, is the documentation. So eyewitness documentation, we see a lot more details with this battle. That being said, we have to remember the case of bias. And that's why the numbers here vary depending on what account you look at. What you'll typically find is if there is a magnificent, air quotes, magnificent set piece battle, the victors will often inflate the size of the people that they face, because it makes it seem that they're that much more courageous or powerful. So it's much more difficult and much more awe-inspiring for them to go out and be outnumbered and defeat their enemy than it is if they're on even ground. So some reports say it was an even match. According to the primary source, though, The Egyptians were outnumbered, and we think the number was 10,000 Egyptians to 15,000 Syrian Canaanite rebels. And these armies consisted of charioteers, war chariots, foot infantry. We had men that had bows and arrows, and the infantry used spears and short stabbing swords of that nature. And we already talked about the Confederation of Princes. Now, why? So a Confederation of Princes under King DeRusha, the Canaanite, which would be near Syria nowadays, thought he could take advantage of the recent death of Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut in Egypt, the political environment was this. The Hatshepsut was the regent of the pharaoh that was involved in this battle. He was that pharaoh's stepmother. And his father, who was a pharaoh, passed when he was a very young boy. This woman, his stepmother, stepped in and acted as his regent and took the throne and became a pharaoh herself. So Hatshepsut was a female pharaoh that, for all intents and purposes, was the co-regent, which was helping rule Egypt. But once she passed away due to natural causes, our commander-in-chief of the armies here, Tamsa, he became pharaoh, but he was kind of a young and pampered lad. And when he took over the position, he was in his early 20s. And their enemies, the Canaanites, saw this as an opportunity to fill that power vacuum and attempt to challenge Egypt. So that's why
weak leadership of the enemy, right, is an opportunity.
Yeah, and that's pretty typical in these old civilizations. We see whenever there's a change in power, or when someone ascends to the throne, or any sort of political upheaval, the adjacent enemies, the surrounding people, will immediately try to invade that empire or attack, or at least revolt and rise up.
Okay.
So, as I mentioned, this is one of the first battles to have an eyewitness account. And from the Temple of Karnak in Luxor, Egypt, is where we find all the details for this. Now, essentially what happened with this is the defining characteristic of this battle is the fact that Tamsa III, even though he initially led a pampered life and he was a very much watched after and to an extent kind of tucked away and put off to the side by his stepmother, who really enjoyed the power of being pharaoh. He still was an educated guy, and he became the commander-in-chief of the army, so he did have some military experience. But the defining characteristic of this battle, what all the scribes talk about and all of our evidence, is how he boldly charged in the battle. He led the chariot charge himself. So that is something that's very much characteristic of the Bronze Age as well. We see these men of power that rule their kingdoms. They're on the front lines of battle. They're not like a modern day general where they're operating from a command center, or even the militaries of like the 19th century, like the Napoleonic Wars, where the generals typically stay in the back and they coordinate everything from a tent or from a mount. These men led their armies directly into battle. If we had to point out the advantages of the two particular sides, the Egyptians had an advantage with their chariots, which were chariots were a nascent technology at this time. They were two-wheeled chariots that had two men in the back. One would be a driver, and one would shoot a bow and arrow, and also operate a shield to protect the driver. The chariots were fairly lightweight. They were pulled by one horse, which made them pretty fast, and they were able to strike targets with their bows and arrows pretty accurately. The other thing the Egyptians had going for them were their archers. They used composite bows, one way of saying, but they used as opposed to a recurve bow, which is made out of like a solid piece of wood. They used composite bows, which were composed of bone and sinew, which basically allow a much higher energy potential to be stored in the bow when you draw it back. So when the arrow is released, it strikes with a much more energy than a less sophisticated bow. And what that translates to during this period anyway is that these arrows were capable of puncturing thin sheets of bronze armor. So what the Egyptians had going for them were like the prototype fighter jets of the period, and they also had these armor-piercing arrows. Now, what the Canaanites had on their side were numbers, and they had a confederation of these princes.
Right. So advanced technology versus numbers.
Right. And we're going to look here real quick. Let me pull up my third thing. Okay. So what essentially happened is this, without belaboring the point, and and there are lecturers that can talk about this one battle for hours, but in these days, the armies were large. We're talking tens of thousands of men, but they did not necessarily engage the enemy on a wide front like we see in movies where the armies are maneuvered, and then we have all 10,000 men marching at the same time, and there's all these elaborate flanking movements and of that nature. What more often than not happened is the army would be on the march, and it would be spread out across a coastal area, and they would march in a long column, and they would purposely spread themselves apart, because you have to keep in mind, when you're moving an army of that size, they have to forage off the land, they have to take an appropriate amount of food with them, they have to space themselves out as to not impact each of the regiments too much. So it's not easy moving armies that large. So typically what you find is when the engagement did take place and the enemies eventually clashed, it wasn't these massive fronts where you had these massive battles. They were smaller, like regiments fighting with one another. And what happened here is mostly he was at the very front of the column. He was working with his advisors, and there were 3 passes that he could have taken to approach the Canaanites. And 2 of them were high road, very mountainous road that would have taken a long time to get there, and one was a very much more direct pass over the plain of Megiddo. And his advisors told him they suggested against taking the quick route, because they anticipated the enemy knowing that they would attempt to do so, and that there would be enemy troops waiting there to cut them off, essentially. The Pharaoh said, no, I'm going to go against every single piece of advice you are giving me. We're going to shoot through this quick pass, then we're going to make camp overnight, and we're going to surprise the enemy in the morning. Of course, they all listened to the Pharaoh, because if you don't listen to the Pharaoh, you get your head chopped off. And they proceeded down this quick pass. They made camp for the night, and lo and behold, when they woke up the next morning, they found their enemy, the Canaanites, out of tactical position. They were not in battle order; they were still in marching order. So
they weren't ready. Like they didn't expect to come so fast.
That's exactly the Canaanites did not anticipate the Egyptians showing up that quickly. And what the Egyptians did is they made very short order of them with a chariot charge, and it sent them into full retreat. They retreated into the walls inside the city of Megiddo, and there was a siege that lasted for 6 to 8 months. It was a relatively bloodless siege, but a siege nonetheless. And at the end of the day, Tamsa III made his enemies swear an oath not to rise up against him again. There were agreements made, and it was relatively bloodless. So what can we say about the entire thing? It's a pretty straightforward battle, a pretty good example of what happened with the war chariots involved in warfare. If you gain the tactical advantage, the high ground, and the element of surprise over your enemy, and the enemy is not within battle order and they're not ready to defend themselves, and especially if you charge them in the flank with these chariots and you send a hail of arrows down, you're going to defeat them. But again, the significance here is it's not a terribly exciting battle, as is the next one we're going to look at, but it's the first one that's recorded, and it set a precedent for the next battle.
Okay.
And it's just an idea of how sophisticated the battles were, even though they happened thousands of years ago. Do you have any questions about this one?
I guess the takeaway. What do you think the key takeaway in terms of strategy is for this battle?
Well, the key takeaway, and I'm going to compare all these once we finish the last battle, but the key takeaway from this one is positioning, timing, and luck. The Pharaoh went on the march at the correct time during the right season to make war, and then he also decided to take the quickest route, the highest road to approach his enemy. But lucky in the fact that he went against his advisors, and he was also very fortunate that his enemy did not have the guards posted at the pass like his advisors had anticipated. Yeah. If he had encountered resistance in that pass, it would have more or less been a turkey shoot, because have you guys seen the movie The 300?
Yeah.
Yeah. So same principle here. If he had a superior force in terms of technology and armament, he still would not have been able to bring them all to bear against his enemy, because if there were sentries posted in that pass, their front would have been much smaller. And if they outnumbered him, they would have been constantly been able to refresh their ranks, and they would have been able to defend their area, and his army would have exhausted their logistics and supply sources, and probably had to turn back to Egypt, and then have to sustain a counterattack, and which could have very well been the demise of Egypt. So there was a lot on the line in this particular battle, and the striking thing about it is he just got incredibly lucky. You know?
Yeah, I mean, he could have easily just been wrong, right?
Yeah, exactly. So
it's because, I mean, obviously we don't know much else about the period of sort of spies and the intelligence, but the takeaways I got was that he allowed people to underestimate him. He was comfortable with that, and that underestimation gave him the option to have the element of the surprise as well. And then seizing that element of surprise, he just went bang straight for them, so that they didn't have a chance.
Yeah, and that's exactly right, because there's when you look at the sources from the period, some people consider, especially his dissenters and his critics, they considered him the pampered prince, so to speak, the boy pharaoh, where his stepmother basically ran everything as a co-regent for I think it was like about 20, 30 years, and he just grew up a life of luxury. All he did was educate himself. But to his credit, as we mentioned, he was the commander-in-chief of the army. He was involved in some limited battles. He wasn't, a complete, novice when it came to the means and ways of war. And also, the other thing to keep in mind too is what we see, especially in the case of Egypt and the surrounding territories and the empires that are involved in these centuries of conflict. These are all ancestral enemies. Their fathers and fathers before them all fought each other. So every time they went to battle, they were taking with them a lot of baggage, so to speak. They had to really save face, and they often, there's accounts of them praying to their ancestors, their fathers, for strength in battle, to represent their family line and protect their people. So yeah, I completely agree, and that's a very accurate takeaway. It's a great observation that he was probably very much aware that people were going to underestimate him, and he wanted to make a quick, decisive strike. And fortunately for him, it worked out.
It worked. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's get that one closed and that one closed. All right. And before I'll say the aftermath, of course, is that it resulted in the consolidated control, Egypt's consolidated control of trade routes, and then it served as him being able to control that land served as a strategic launching point for further raids into Mesopotamia and the Tigris and Euphrates, where Egypt could expand its empire. So this battle is what really cemented Egypt as not just a great civilization, but was the makings of an early Egyptian empire, so to speak. All right. All right. So now the Battle of Kadesh. This happened in a very, very, very similar area. Almost, I mean, when you look at it on the map, if you're to throw a dart at it, chances are you'd hit the same place. But it was a bit further north of the previous battle. And if you look at the map here, I unfortunately couldn't get a larger image, but if you look directly east of Cyprus, we have Kadesh right there. So you can see it's a little further north, somewhat of a little further inland. But again, Kadesh was a very important location in the idea that it geographically, we're going back to the idea that it was vital to overland trade routes, and it was also of strategic importance because it was a great launching point for armies to begin their invasions into foreign lands. So pretty much the same area, but This is taking place in 1285 BC, 172 years after the previous battle, or roughly 5 generations. And the reason I bring that up is because I just want to emphasize the point that this is another set-piece battle. But most battles of the period were not of this scale and scope. They didn't involve this many troops. Because, again, it's very difficult to organize, to get your levies up, to organize that, the number of troops, the conscription process. Also, having just the logistics behind it, feeding and moving the army is immense. I mean, they had scouts where, just the idea, I mean, if you really think about it, imagine you're in charge of, 20,000 people. I don't know about you guys, but I mean, like, what's the largest place you've ever been in, like a stadium or something like that? You think 20,000 people. This is before the time of radios and, the modern communications we have today. How do you relay the simple fact that, our scouts see the enemy on the horizon? We need to turn this entire column east, and we need to establish our front and have everyone lined up. So it's incredibly large numbers of people in somewhat primitive times. And the idea that they can put all this together and move these armies is it's staggering. It's overwhelming. So the Battle of Kadesh, now our pharaoh in Egypt is Ramses II, which is a much more familiar name. I think a lot of people are familiar with Ramses, versus the Hittite Empire under King Muwatalus. And this involves about 20,000 Egyptians and about 40,000 Hittites. Same situation here. This is all documented at Luxor on the walls through engravings and hieroglyphics of that nature. So we have a lot of details about the battle. We do know that the Egyptians were definitely outnumbered in this battle, although the specific numbers do vary. And same situation here. Egypt, in this case, had speed and arrows on their side. The Hittites, however, were a little more sophisticated than the previous adversary. They had greater numbers, but they also had their own war chariots. Their war chariots were larger, and they were armored. So their chariots were slower, but they were much more durable. They had stronger wheels, and they were capable of taking much more punishment and abuse. So technologically, the level is a lot more close here. So the Egyptians even have kind of a smaller margin of victory, because we're looking at, the numbers are really significant at this point, especially when the technology is that much closer. And why did Ramses pursue this? Because Ramses was trying to expand his empire. And essentially what happened during this battle. Now, this is where this battle it's a little more exciting than the previous battle, and it's a little more detailed with our records. The battle occurred in 3 phases. Ramses, almost all battles up until modern day, even to an extent today, most set-piece battles where you're moving large number of troops occur during the spring and the summer. That's your warring season, because you need to be able to forage when you're on the move, and it's much easier to move when crops are readily available.
Would you say you need to be able to forage on the move, like make weapons on the move?
Well, no, like seeking forage for your horses, not foraging.
Forage. Forage. Sorry.
Yeah, forage. So you need to be able to forage on the move. Yeah. So you need to be able to replenish your stocks on the move and feed the army on the move. So the warring seasons were spring and summer, and they also timed it so that they could conscript soldiers into the army after the harvest, because you don't want to take too many people out of the field, otherwise you're going to see dramatic drops.
It's like we just harvested the grain, we got the grain, now those people are free.
Now go to war.
The army, let's get these Hittites.
Yeah. So the people at the time, they were, for lack of a better term, they were fired up about this. They're incredibly excited because they saw Ramses, the pharaoh, as their god king, and he had this divine vision of what Egypt should be, this Egyptian empire. And he put together this army and decided to go on the march with the express intent of smashing the Hittites and taking over Kadesh and expanding his empire. And it's just that simple.
So they were the aggressors, huh?
Yes. They're the aggressors in both cases. I mean, in the first case, we had the revolt, and they're basically aggressively suppressing the revolt. In this case, it was just a complete invasion of a foreign territory to
okay. I was always under the impression, I don't know why, that the Hittites were like these barbarians that were constantly trying to attack Egypt.
Well, and no, that is true to an extent. I wouldn't necessarily say they were barbarians, because they did achieve a level of sophistication comparable to Egypt.
Oh, really?
They did have technology comparable to the Egyptians.
Oh.
But they did invade Egypt, and all these empires and these civilizations, especially in the Levant, Mesopotamia, Egypt, they were all constantly warring with each other. I mean, Egypt suffered defeats at the hands of these people, although to a lesser extent, and then they counterattacked. It's just these two particular battles are what we refer to as set piece battles, because they involve such a large number of troops and they're so well documented.
Why do they use that term, set piece? What is that getting at?
Set piece, it's just a term that we use to describe a large battle of significance that defines the political and social mood of the period. And the outcome of the battle typically has vast repercussions for the civilizations involved in
okay.
Yeah, so D-Day, that would be a set piece battle.
Is it like PIECE or
set piece? SET, yeah, PIECE, yeah.
Okay.
Essentially like a set piece that you would have on your kitchen table. It's a set piece. It's something that really defines the entire period.
It's a defining piece. Okay.
Yeah. So the three phases of this battle, Ramses set out, and he set out initially on the march. Let me pull up this map again. He set up on the march, and if you see down here in Egypt, you have Memphis, where you have the Nile River, the mouth of the Nile River. He set out from the delta, the river delta, and went up the coast across the Sinai Peninsula towards Kadesh. And when he was doing this, remember, his army was so large that they could not march abreast of each other, and they could not arrive all at the same time, nor did they want to. It would just it's not feasible to support an army for that structure. So they would march in these long, stretched out columns. And the regiments, the troops be broken down into different sections, and regiments were the largest subsection of the army. And Ramses was in the front regiment of his entire army, again leading from the front, and they proceeded up the coast. He was the first one to arrive at Kadesh, and he was so enthralled with getting to battle, and he wanted to. There was such an impetus for him to get there that he pushed his regiment harder and faster than the regiments behind him. And his idea was, well, I'm going to get there. I'm going to set up camp, and I'm going to send my scouts out, and I'm going to survey this area, and then we're going to come up with our war plan, and we'll lay siege to Kadesh, or we'll engage the army. So in the first phase, he moves to Kadesh. When they get there, you made reference to intelligence and scouts earlier. The enemy scouts, enemy spies, they posed as villagers and farmers. And when Ramses captured them, they started interrogating them, asking them, what's the position of the army? Or have you seen a Hittite army? They said, no, we're just simple farmers, but what we can tell you is we haven't seen any Hittites around here. We haven't heard anything about an army on the move or anything like that. You're the first person we've seen. We've just been busy farming. And Ramses took that at face value, and he set up camp and basically, was not in a posture to fight. Lo and behold, the Hittite army was right there around. They were basically hiding around the foot of a mountain. And as soon as Ramses set camp, they began positioning their army and maneuvering it. And again, this takes place over hours and, a couple of days. This is not something that happens overnight. But they position themselves, and they are preparing to pounce on Ramses. Well, as they're moving their army in place, Ramses he realizes that he's made a terrible mistake. His scouts are reporting back that they see this army on the move. They're basically coming around the corner of the mountain, and they're positioning themselves to deliver a death blow, essentially. Ramses, in very short order, he passes the word, and he brings everyone up, and he tells them to, begin getting in a defensive formation. And he sends two of his fastest scouts back the way they had come to ask to seek reinforcements. To basically tell the remainder of his army, those other regiments that are on the way, hey, you guys need to hurry up. We're about to get in a fight. Well, the scouts, as those scouts are arriving to pass word so they can get reinforcements, the regiments, his reinforcements that are on the march, are ambushed by another element of the Hittite army that was also in hiding. And their chariots come down from the high ground and smash into the Egyptians, smash into their flanks, and decimate one of the regiments. So now the people that Ramses was hoping on to save his bacon, save his skin, they're engaged in a complete conflict behind him on the battlefield. They can't come to his aid. And at this time, the Hittites, another element of their chariot army, rushes down the hill towards Ramses' camp, and they say, okay, we're going to deliver the death stroke now. Let's attack them. So Ramses gets out on the battlefield himself. He organizes what little men he has in his regiment, and he sweeps around in a wide arc. And this is phase two with the Hittite ambush and the counterattack. Ramses swings around in like a wheel motion, and it's basically every man for himself. He's raining arrows down upon the Hittites. There are charges and counter charges, and they basically get into this enormous fight. Meanwhile, the remainder of his army, although his reinforcements are badly injured from the Hittite ambush, they're able to fight off that Hittite ambush, and the soldiers that are remaining rush forward to help them. As they're rushing forward to help, the Hittites mount a second chariot charge, and now you just have complete chaos. And there's the accounts of this battle are men getting ripped off of chariots, getting decapitated on the field, chariots smashing into each other, arrows blacking out the sky. I mean, this is some, end of the world sort of stuff. The third phase of the battle is where we see where the Hittites miscalculated, and all of their infantry was too far, their foot soldiers were too far away and too far back from where the action was going on. And although they had sent their infantry in motion, they had to cross a river that stood between them and the battlefield and the city, which slowed their advance. And it gave Ramses enough time to gather his troops, mount a counteroffensive, and destroy the Hittites, destroy the chariots, their chariot army. So he repelled them. And then he reformed his ranks, reformed all of his chariots. And by the time the infantry showed up, they weren't ready to withstand a chariot charge. So they had to retreat to Kadesh and retreat within the walls of Kadesh. And it's at this point where they're at an impasse, because Ramses' forces are not in good shape. He's been bloodied quite significantly. And the Hittite camp is not in good shape because they've lost all their chariots, but their infantry can't exactly face Ramses' forces. So they come to an agreement, and they agree to basically cease hostilities, and they sign a peace treaty, the Peace Treaty of Kadesh, which is the first peace treaty that we have on record.
Okay.
And that's what happened. So very interesting battle with all the movements that we have here. And this is something that military history lecturers, if they're strategists and people that are very much interested in this today, even today's military academies, they still discuss this. And you can conduct an hour-long class on the specific movements and the minutia of how this entire battle unraveled and took place.
So it seems like the Hittites, they were thinking ahead better. Like they seem to have some better plan. Is that true, or were they lucky, or did they?
You're right. They did. Ramses made a critical mistake in stretching his army too thin. Well, yeah. it was a compound mistake. He stretched his army incredibly thin, and then he advanced well ahead of his reinforcements. He stretched out his supply lines to too great of an extent, and he left himself vulnerable. And then he also took the information of the spies and the citizens that he captured. He took it at face value, which would have set him up for failure. And the Hittites, they had him at every step of the way. They ambushed his reinforcements. They smashed chariots into his flank. They were able to initially outmaneuver him at his camp and deliver a very devastating blow. Where the Hittites screwed up is they did the same thing. They overstretched their lines, and they weren't. If they could have maneuvered their infantry to engage Ramses' forces and perform the cleanup, so to speak, after the initial chariot charge, they would have defeated Ramses. And there's a very likely chance that if the Hittites would have won this battle, our entire history as Western civilization could have been rewritten. A lot of the Bible is based upon the Exodus and Egypt, and the Levant, that entire area in Christianity was very much shaped by all the activity going on during this period. If the Hittites would have won, they were they could have taken us in a completely different direction, and the very fabric of the Western world and the world today could have been rewritten essentially. So it's a really compelling what if.
Interesting.
So we've got personal qualities of the leadership again, because Ramses is fighting his ancestral enemy.
Yes.
He's let his pride overtake. So strategy's kind of gone out the window. Pride's taken over. He's charging ahead. He wants to be the man. And the Hittites, they've got armored vehicles. So they've created vehicles almost in anticipation that these chariots that can throw spears and bows and arrows are going to come at them. So they've decided not, because last week I think we talked about assimilating weapons. Yes. Whereas this week we seem to have like, well, we know these guys do this. We know that they do it in the summer, and we know that where we are is important. So let's defend ourselves, and possibly let's, know how our land is, even though they made that error with the river.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point you bring up, Ian, as well. I failed to mention that. Thank you. The Hittite war chariots, well, they were much more durable than the Egyptian chariots. They lacked speed and maneuverability, and that's one of the things that could be attributed to their difficulty in sustaining the Egyptian counterattack, is they were not as they could not maneuver their chariots as easily as the Egyptians could in such close corners. Because you got to remember, the Hittite war chariots, they charged into Ramses' camp. We're talking, tents, ropes. This is a war camp. So it's not an open plain or an open field of battle. And Ramses was able to mobilize his lighter, quicker chariots a lot more quickly, execute a large wheel pattern, a large sweep, and then while the Hittites were trapped basically in the camp trying to maneuver their chariots, he delivered a charge to them, and that's how he repelled them. So I mean, what are the big takeaways? We talked about it. We're discussing it right now. I would think one is talking about the first battle at Talenza, shrouded in mystery. But the one thing we know for sure is that man has been fighting since the dawn of recorded history, and then we have to ask ourselves, what does this say about the nature of man? Have we changed at all today? We mentioned some of the great philosophers in the previous webinar: Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, those guys. It's just something to think about. Why do we fight? Why do we continue doing it? The other thing is planning and positioning are of utmost importance. There's a time to take advice and there's a time to ignore it. We saw instances where ignoring advice was successful, and where taking advice and taking a measured approach was successful as well. Third thing, best laid plans often do not survive first contact, and that's something we can discuss in subsequent webinars. But Helmuth von Moltke was a 19th century military strategist, and he's credited with this quote, which I think really sums it up quite nicely. The best laid plans often do not survive first contact with the enemy. You can make all these wonderful plans and set out these wonderful strategies, but as soon as the bullets start flying or the spears start flying or the arrows, so to speak, everything can just break down to utter chaos.
That's like everyone's got a plan until they get hit, right?
Exactly. And the last thing is luck. It's fickle, but it's important. And I think in these two instances here with these two set piece battles, the two Egyptian battles, we see instances where the commanders were essentially lucky. I mean, there's no better way to define it. There's certainly an element of strategy involved, and we can't doubt their bravery, especially when they're fighting from the very front of their regiments. But luck certainly had a part to play. Chance.
Okay. Awesome. I guess Brilliant. You gotta go, right?
Yes. Unfortunately, I got my morning booked, and I'm gonna have to run. For our next lecture, I'll leave it up to you guys. We can go in two directions, and you can feel free to message me on Skype, whatever you'd like to do. You can discuss amongst yourselves. We can either transition into the Iron Age, and we can look at some Greek battles, and we could talk about like the Battle of Marathon and Iron Age cultures. Or we can remain in the Bronze Age, and we can go over to China for a bit and discuss the Warring States period and the Ottoman Spring periods.
Yeah, let's do the second option.
Okay, China. Okay, so we'll do that. Okay, so I'll prepare a lecture on those periods, Chinese periods, and we can discuss that on Friday.
Looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thank you, Bob.
All right. Always a pleasure, Thanks. Gentlemen. You have a great evening.
Have a good one. See you later.
Bye.